Ever since the gangly rail splitter from Kentucky, who worked as a traveling lawyer in Illinois, emerged from relative obscurity to become the 16th President of the United States of America, people have been fascinated by Abraham Lincoln. So much so that the Lincoln caricature has made an astounding number of appearances on the big screen and small screen over a span of more than 100 years. These appearances have included multiple genres: dramas, epics, biographies, and even love stories, such as the 1914 film Lincoln the Lover, about his ill-fated romance with Anne Rutledge. In addition to the 1930 biopic Abraham Lincoln starring Walter Huston and the 2012 Lincoln starring Daniel Day-Lewis, his character has made cameos in everything from The Lone Ranger in 1938 to Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure in 1989. Some of his recent appearances have been downright bizarre, but if people can find entertainment in imagining Abraham Lincoln as a vampire hunter, we can find edification in imagining Abraham Lincoln as a football coach. So knowing what we know about Abraham Lincoln the person, let's imagine, what would Abraham Lincoln have been like as a college football coach rather than a president? First of all, Coach Lincoln would want the top job. It is a myth that Lincoln was a reluctant leader who was thrust into the presidency almost against his will. In the Pulitzer Prize-winning Team of Rivals, Doris Kearns Goodwin demonstrates that Lincoln was both ambitious and shrewd in politics. Speaking about his aspirations toward the beginning of his political career, Lincoln remarked, "I have no other ambition so great as that of being truly esteemed of my fellow men, by rendering myself worthy of their esteem." And he worked to reach high office and earn the esteem of his countrymen. He skillfully maneuvered behind the scenes of the Republican primary in Chicago to put himself in a position where he would have a chance to win if the delegates couldn't coalesce around one of the frontrunners. So despite repeated failures and a series of setbacks, Coach Lincoln would work for years, if necessary, to earn a head coaching position. Coach Lincoln would bring with him an encyclopedic knowledge of the techniques and tactics of football, along with a broad education in the liberal arts, which would have been acquired almost entirely through self-study. Lincoln's opportunities for formal education were limited. So as he said, his education was acquired in littles. But the young Lincoln would scour the countryside and search for books that he could get his hands on. Lincoln became so familiar with the Bible, Shakespeare, Aesop's fables, that he could quote long passages from memory during conversations and speeches. Lincoln had to struggle to get information in a way that you and I don't. If you're watching this, there's a good chance you could afford an $80 e-reader and internet access fast enough to download literally tens of thousands of the best literary works in human history, which are now out of copyright, for free. Coach Lincoln would devote himself fully to the cause without losing himself in the job. For Lincoln, the Civil War was about preserving the Union, and above all else, to prove that a free people were capable of governing themselves, that a democratic nation conceived in liberty could long endure. There would be no doubt that Lincoln's teams were trying to win, but he would be about more than just wins and losses. And he would never compromise his principles to achieve his objectives. Coach Lincoln would be intent on winning the right way. Coach Lincoln would stay grounded by balancing his home life and his work life, in part by not compartmentalizing his home life and his work life. Lincoln's sons were in and out of his office all day, and as restless children, in and out of his lap as he waited to make speeches at public events. Lincoln wasn't fond of imposing rules or restrictions on his boys, and said that it was his pleasure that his children are free, happy, and unconstrained by paternal tyranny. Because as he explained, love is the chain whereby to lock a child to its parent. For Lincoln the coach, during practices, his sons would walk along the sidelines as he moved about, and they would play on his office floor as he met with assistant coaches or players, and sit on his lap as he watched film. Coach Lincoln would also stay grounded by using humor to deal with the stresses of coaching and the ups and downs that come with wins and losses. Though in private, his melancholy nature might cause him to agonize over defeats and worry about upcoming contests, he would be astonishingly jovial with his players and assistants. Lincoln said that sometimes he would laugh so that he didn't weep. Coach Lincoln might even make self-deprecating jokes to his players and members of the media after a loss. Coach Lincoln would begin his career with a massive recruiting network. Before rising to prominence, Lincoln had traveled extensively as an attorney, and during his early adulthood had spent countless late-night hours telling amusing stories and slightly inappropriate jokes to his growing network of friends, many of whom were his opponents on the legal circuit. Lincoln loved being around people, and people loved being around Lincoln. So Lincoln the football coach would have a lot of people who wanted to play for him, or have their sons or nephews or grandsons play for him. And he would have high school coaches all over the nation eager to send him their best players. Because when we like someone, we want them to be successful. While recruiting, Coach Lincoln wouldn't speak ill against any other coach or program. For in so doing, he would say more about his character than the character of his opponent. Lincoln made very few promises, and during political campaigns admonished his surrogates not to make promises on his behalf, as politicians so often do to win political support. Instead, Lincoln wanted them to emphasize to others that he would treat everyone fairly if elected. Coach Lincoln would not make empty living room promises to players about playing time, except for the promise that they would be given a fair opportunity to earn their starting position. No matter how large the roster, Coach Lincoln would get to know every one of his players by name, including the guys on the practice squad. And he would probably know about all their friends and families as well, and the friends and families of his team managers, athletic trainers, and support staff. Because he would make an effort to get to know them, regardless of what he thought that they might be able to do for him. He would be particularly close with kids who came from difficult circumstances, being able to empathize with those who had endured tragedy at a young age or had grown up in impoverished circumstances. Now, I know that it sounds preposterous for a college football coach to know each of his players as people. But a football roster is minuscule compared to the number of people with whom Abraham Lincoln was acquainted. While serving as President of the United States of America, Abraham Lincoln had an open-door policy. Think about that for a moment. People who wanted to meet Lincoln, mostly to ask a favor, as tens of thousands did, could just go to the White House and talk to him. So Lincoln, the coach, would certainly have an open-door policy for his players, and probably for his players' families, the fans and boosters, and anyone else who wanted to talk to him. Like President Lincoln, Coach Lincoln would be an excellent listener. Now, of course, our country has over 300 million people, so it's understandable that our president would have a closed door. But do you think the football coach at your university would let the average student get near him? Oh, but he's so busy. Abraham Lincoln was the president of a country during a civil war. Just something to think about. Lincoln's open-door policy is awe-inspiring. In addition to welcoming all those who called upon him by day, President Lincoln spent most of his evenings with his cabinet members. So Coach Lincoln would probably spend his evenings visiting his assistants in their homes or walking across campus to hang out with his players in their dorm rooms or apartments or frat houses. On his way, he would be greeted by enthusiastic hordes of adoring students with whom he would graciously pose for selfies, then amuse his fans with self-deprecating jokes and slightly inappropriate anecdotes. Once he got there, rather than focus on game strategy, he would spend most of every evening asking about the lives of his assistants or players and telling stories and anecdotes, some poignant, some amusing, but always memorable and usually entertaining. And most would be embedded with a lesson, which would illustrate a point he was trying to get across. And this would allow him to deliver bad news clearly and honestly, while minimizing the likelihood that he would spoil a relationship. When a player needed to be demoted, he would look the player in the eye and tell the truth. But Coach Lincoln would soften the message with an encouraging word and somehow come up with a reassuring anecdote. And in so doing, he would strengthen friendships and engender deep loyalty among members of the team. Although Lincoln was a master of making friends, Coach Lincoln would choose assistants who were incredibly good at their jobs, rather than simply giving jobs to friends and allies. In fact, he would be intentional about hiring people who could help him build alliances. In Team of Rivals, Doris Kearns Goodwin describes the process by which Lincoln assembled his cabinet, choosing a Secretary of State, a Secretary of War, a Secretary of Navy, a Postmaster General, and so on. As Goodwin summarized, Lincoln made clear his determination to create a compact body by drawing the former rivals into his official household, and he explained that in order to preserve the Union, we needed the strongest men of the part in the cabinet. We needed to hold our own people together. I had looked the party over and concluded that these were the very strongest men. Then I had no right to deprive the country of their services. Now, it's important to note that although he selected former political rivals who would run against him in the Republican primary, these were people with whom he shared values regarding preservation of the Union and stopping the spread of slavery. He disregarded personal rivalries, but maintained a commitment to the principles for which he stood, hiring people who could buy into his vision after overcoming bitterness and jealousy. Early in his career, Lincoln deferred quite a bit to his generals and his Secretary of War regarding military strategy. So early in his coaching career, Coach Lincoln might defer somewhat to his offensive and defensive coordinators, based on his trust in their expertise, but would keep ultimate control over decisions that needed to be made. But later in his career, he would be more involved in play calling, while allowing his coordinators to feel that they had the autonomy to do their jobs well, having his support, his appreciation, and a clear understanding of the objectives they were expected to achieve. Coach Lincoln would give brief but meticulously planned speeches on a regular basis. He would spend time thinking about what he really wanted to say, then write it out, and tinker with it continuously for days or weeks, until moments before he gave the speech. This would be particularly true for speeches made at the beginning of the season, where he would tell his players what they were going to accomplish and why they needed to succeed in that mission. Though speaking poetically, He would leave no ambiguity as to what he expected of his players as individuals and as a team. And in each speech, he would continually reaffirm his vision for the team, for the season, and for the program. In addition to his short but well thought out speeches, Coach Lincoln would always be ready to graciously deliver a few extemporaneous words whenever called upon by players or fans, which would connect a frank assessment of the present with a hopeful vision for the future. Lincoln always seemed to have one eye on the times and one eye on the timeless. Although Lincoln was a legendary orator, Coach Lincoln would probably avoid talking to the media whenever possible, but would be gracious and patient with reporters when he was obligated to appear at press conferences. Although Lincoln is usually considered to be one of the best president in the history of the United States, he was absolutely brutalized by the media, especially during his first term in office. But when criticized, Lincoln usually preferred to remain silent and let the truth emerge, such that his accusers would eventually be shown to be wrong in their criticism. Lincoln was incredibly patient, but he was also human, and he certainly got angry at times. But he kept tight control of his anger, in part by writing scorching letters to those who angered him, but then filing those letters away in his desk drawer. So given the demands of a college football coach and the criticism that comes from all sides, Coach Lincoln probably would have a pretty full drafts folder in his email account. And in keeping his thoughts to himself, Coach Lincoln would always avoid making enemies and leave the door of friendship open to rivals. One of the reasons that Lincoln had so many loyal followers, especially in the Union Army and among the military families, was his habit of issuing pardons to officers and soldiers who had deserted or committed other offenses on the battlefield. Abraham Lincoln signed more letters of pardon than any other president before or after. And signing letters of pardon was a joy to Lincoln, who was energized by the thought of finding a loophole with which he could justify sparing a young man's life. This habit irritated some of the high-ranking military officers in his command, who feared that discipline would erode. So Coach Lincoln wouldn't be particularly good at punishing players. Instead, he would be a champion of forgiveness and grace, which might put him at odds with his administration in the NCAA at times. But Lincoln understood that discipline is not the same thing as punishment. The word discipline comes from the same root word as disciple, and many of the Union soldiers, who cheered their gangly, awkward leader as he rode through the camps during his many visits to the front lines, were almost like disciples of Lincoln. So discipline was apparently not a problem for the Union Army, because the vast majority of the soldiers believed in the vision that Lincoln preached and fought not only for their country, but for their beloved leader. Coach Lincoln would certainly replace players who weren't performing well with those who might be able to serve the team better on the field, but he would do so quietly so as to minimize the embarrassment that the demoted player might endure. But it is preposterous to imagine Coach Lincoln yelling, "Get on the line," during practice. This just wouldn't be Lincoln-like leadership. Now, if you think the idea of learning about sport coaching by studying Abraham Lincoln seems a little odd, consider that John Wooden, who is considered the greatest coach in the history of American sports, basically moonlighted as a Lincoln scholar. Coach Wooden read thousands of pages about Abraham Lincoln and considered Abraham Lincoln to be his favorite American. And if you study Wooden's leadership, You'll see very quickly that it wasn't magic, as the Wizard of Westwood nickname would imply, but meticulous attention to principles, including many of the leadership principles displayed by our nation's 16th president, that made John Wooden so successful.